Okay. Hi Vermont history students, and this is the video for Unit 6. This is Wednesday morning, and I'm going to make this video and hopefully make a complete video, and then go upstairs and respond to the discussion question, see where you're at as far as that goes, and then also I have some assessment papers to grade, which is exciting. Just to introduce the unit, this is the halfway point of the course, and it's really kind of, the 6th of 12 units, the 3rd of 6 weeks, but it's also the halfway point of Vermont history in a really important way, because the 1890s, the end of the Gilded Age, is the big turning point in Vermont history. And what happened was summer tourism got huge, and that is fundamental to the creation of Vermont's contemporary identity and way that people think about the state and the way that the state functions. The premise, hopefully, of uphill and downhill makes sense to you, but what happens is, up until summer tourism got huge in the 1890s, it's really sort of a matter of it being a blurry, sort of looking through like a blurry camera lens, and then when tourism gets big, then what contemporary Vermont is like now starts to become a lot more clear. Before tourism got big, you know what downhillers wanted. They wanted progress, they wanted development, they wanted factories. If they saw a copper field, they would say, let's strip mine it. And uphillers wanted things to stay the same. But then when tourism comes in, the reason why Vermont became this epicenter of summer tourism is because it was so backward. And backwardness used to be, for downhillers, the worst thing about it. In the Gilded Age, downhillers thought Vermont was in decline, whereas uphillers thought it was stable. But the fact that it had not just this landscape that was beautiful, but also had this identity as being untouched by the modern world, went from being the downhillers thinking it's the worst thing about the state to being the best thing about the state, its greatest asset. But tourism is a weird industry. It's not like a copper field. There is a law of diminishing returns. Downhillers were like, great, we can use summer tourism in order to develop the state. But if you develop the state too much, then you destroy the very thing that you're selling. So there needs to be limitations, on how much you can actually develop the state through tourism without destroying tourism. And then that's how you end up with Act 250 and all the zoning and regulation we have now, and downhillers being very confused. And it's a true thing about downhillers. Most dangerous thing to Vermont is confused downhillers. Because even when they don't understand what's going on, they will do something. They always do. They're very busy in that way. They will form committees and associations and pursue something and usually screw things up. But that's how people like me are. So that's the introduction to the unit. I'm going to try to keep this video short. I know that the last 2 of them got cut off, and I think that's probably because they were like 13 minutes or something like that. My goal is to have them be 9 to 10 minutes. Assessment papers. I'm about to grade one. The whole point is, tell me, between X date and X date, it usually will be determined by what articles you use, and there are those articles in the article folders for each of the 6 parts of the course. Please do use multiple sources. In addition to the textbook and class notes, use some articles too, would be really nice. But generally speaking, what you're talking about is about 50 years, between 1770 and 1820. I mean, it can be between 1777 and 1843. I mean, whatever the evidence you're using is. But don't try to solve the world's problems with one paper. 40 years is fine. But your first sentence of your paper, please make it easy on me. Between this date and this date, Vermont became more unified, more divided. Whatever you want to say is fine with me. I'm not really grading you on your response. I'm just grading you on how well you argue it. And remember, the whole goal is to tell the history of Vermont like a story, right? You're going to write 3 of these identical papers and sort of link them together so you can sort of tell the history of Vermont like a story, and then you can understand contemporary Vermont in historical perspective. Because history is not dates and facts, it's not memorizing things. It's a story you tell yourself about yourself, right? Okay, so that's great. I think that's the essence of what I wanted to say about assessment papers. Alright, so here's the thing. The unit's broken into 4 sections. And the 1st and the 3rd are actually on this book project I'm working on, and it's not self-indulgent of me, to be introducing that material into the course. It's actually really good for people to use old material, new material, introduce new material into a course, because then the course keeps evolving and stays fresh. Thing about it is that I mean, so this book is actually in the final editing stages. When I wrote my previous book, there was this story about this Swedish immigration recruitment program, and I thought, boy, that's really weird. And a lot of people talked about it in 1890 a lot, and then it disappeared, and everyone agreed not to talk about it again. And I wondered what happened to the Swedes and what was the deal with that. So I put an article that I wrote on this on the page, and I would like it if you read that, just because it gives you a sense of where we're going with this. But here's what happened, right? There's all those fears in the Gilded Age about Vermont being in decline, and it wasn't just economic decline, but also the quality of the people. The best, most ambitious people were leaving was the narrative, and that left behind the dissipated Yankees. And also, there's a huge element of anti-Catholicism in the state, and French Canadians and Irish people coming, and that's bad too. So Downhillers decided they needed to gather information on the state and plot ways forward to rectify the state's decline. So this position of Commissioner of Agriculture was started in 1888. In the spring of 1889, they appointed this dude, Alonzo Valentine, to be the commissioner. He didn't know anything about agriculture, really. He owned a factory in Bennington that made women's underwear, for what it's worth. And so he tried to gather some information, although the circulars, these things that he sent out to the small towns, asking them how many farms they had and how much manufacturing they had, no one returned them. But right away he started, two things are weird. Number one, he started to talk publicly and openly about how Vermont was full of abandoned farms, which is weird because there aren't abandoned farms. There are farms that have been sold and consolidated and turned back into woodlot or are for sale, but there's no people just walked away from farms. And this became a big point of contention because he kept saying it. And then the second thing is, he immediately started talking about how he knew that Vermont's future should be staked on recruiting Scandinavians, which is weird too. And so then he sent out these circulars, these notices saying that he wanted to recruit Scandinavians, and the word spread far and wide, and all these people were like, what? That's crazy. Or some people thought it was a really good idea, reverse the state's decline by recruiting Swedes. And it became this big topic of discussion. And in the September of 1889, he got this guy named Nordgren, who was a Swede who lived in Nebraska, who used to recruit Swedes to Nebraska, to come and tour the state, and they settled on Vershire, Wilmington, and Weston as the towns in Vermont where they would settle these colonies. And this is a big topic of discussion. Newspapers, the New York Times, Texas, San Francisco, Chicago, people are talking about this. And whether or not the Swedes thing was just a gimmick or whatever it was, people around the country were, because it was so weird, talking about how Vermont farms are super cheap and can be had for virtually free. The state's full of abandoned farms. Now, the second part puts that in perspective, which is Vermont will be sold as a pristine, pastoral, resplendently perfect, unspoiled place. But in fact, it had plenty of industry. And it had child labor, it had strikes, it had workplace violence, it had workplace injuries, it had immigrants working long hours. I mean, it's just like the rest of the country, really, and that's an important perspective to have as we move forward. So I told you the story. The Vershire War is interesting, and particularly I focus on the power of the downhill elite, whose fortunes were made by industry, especially Redfield Proctor, who owned the Vermont Marble Company. And Proctor was a hugely important political figure in the state, and he owned the Vermont Marble Company in Rutland. And when the Knights of Labor arose in 1885 and 86, the workers not only organized in the workplace, but they also organized in the ballot box and got one of their own number elected representative to the legislature on the United Labor ticket. And this is the power of a Gilded Age elite in Vermont. Redfield Proctor didn't want to be in a town that his workers ran, so he went to the state legislature and had them divide Rutland into 3 new towns: Rutland, Rutland City, West Rutland, and he carved out the part of North Rutland that he lived in, and then he named it after himself. He called it Proctor, which is badass. It's really, well, okay, not only am I going to get my own town, but I'm going to name it after myself, which is pretty cool. So you have that perspective, okay? Now, back to the third section of the course, which is that then what happened was Nordgren went to Sweden in the winter of '89 with a map that Valentine had brought up that showed huge amounts of the state as being full of abandoned farms. And Nordgren went back to his hometown in a place called Varmland, a county in Varmland in Sweden, and he recruited about 55 impoverished lumberjacks and their families. In the meantime, back in Vermont, it was this huge discussion. Why are we giving farms to Swedes? Why aren't we giving them to poor Vermont kids who really want them? I mean, there's a lot of people, kids in Vermont, people in their 20s who really like to have farms, but they're doing odd jobs because they can't afford them. But we're giving them away to other people, and this is crazy. We're spending money on this. The saying was that they were going to give each of the Swedes who came over $25 and a cow. And so people thought this was a lot of people thought it was a terrible idea. So big portions of the press thought that Valentine was a genius. And the people arrived in April. The Swedes and Nordgren, they went to Liverpool from Oslo, and they got on the British Princess and arrived in Philadelphia. Valentine met them, and he took them up and he divided them into 3 colonies. One in Wilmington, one in Vershire, one in Weston. The one in Vershire failed immediately. But the other one, the one in Weston, it wasn't actually in Weston. They got dumped down in a town next to it called Landgrove. Landgrove is this little tiny spit of land, a little gore, and it was incredibly poor and isolated. But there was work up on the mountain in the lumber operations, so they were put in a boarding house. These, I think, 4 or 5 families, and then forgotten about. And I'll leave the story there in the summer of 1890. With what's going to happen to the Swedes, because I have researched their lives. I've focused on the Landgrove colony, those families. But Wilmington received some Swedes, but they understood that what Valentine had done was he had broadcast nationwide the fact that Vermont farms could be had really cheap as summer homes. He'd compiled the first ever comprehensive list of farms for sale. And he had set up a network of people around the state who were willing to have him pass on to them people requesting information on farms for summer homes. And so he'd set up the whole infrastructure that could be used to promote tourism. Tourism would have gotten big anyway, but Valentine played an instrumental part in the direction that it took. And the people in Wilmington, the downhillers, understood this was the case. And a railroad was coming through for the first time, the Deerfield Valley Railroad, and they built a hotel on the banks of this pond there, it was called Ray's Pond, and the Ray family lived right on the pond. They lived there for 100 years. But the people in Wilmington thought that Ray's Pond was not a romantic enough name, so they renamed it Lake Raponda. Lake Raponda, which sounds French or something. And so that's a metaphor for what downhillers are going to do, right? They're going to stop it with the develop, and they're going to start to fashion the state so that it can be sold as a pastoral paradise. But is that good for uphillers? Does that make downhillers respect uphillers more? That's the discussion question, is if downhillers before thought uphill Vermont was in decline, now they see it as a money-making opportunity. Its backwardness is an asset. We want to keep it backward. Is that good for downhillers, or is that even more of a threat to their way of life than the downhillers had been before? And that's a really important question, and obviously it continues up to the present when downhillers are super into keeping things from getting developed and zoning everything and preventing uphillers from having jobs, So that's where we want to be on Friday by noon, and hopefully this video is not too long, and thanks, and write me